Live from York, this is the Late Late Show with Christopher Vowles on Teachers Talk Radio.
Good evening and welcome. Tonight we welcome ex-teacher and researcher Kate Fox as we discuss non-formal education practices in Tanzania. So join us as we explore developing a research career after teaching, the relationship between education and international development, and non-formal literacy teaching and learning in Tanzania.
Live from York, this is the Late Late Show with Christopher Vowles on Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live on the Podbean app or desktop player. Just head over to www.podbean.com/lsw/ttradio or search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio.
Well, hello everyone and welcome to the Sunday Late Show. Since last month's show, I have spent much of my time scrutinising copies of examination scripts for examiner errors, analysing exam results and triple-checking Russell Group University English language entry criteria, while also learning the names of my new students, preparing resource booklets for the autumn term and trying to remember my new teaching timetable. Although the summer weather soon disappears with the arrival of autumn, it is incredible how long the summer administration lingers into September. It was only 3 weeks ago, for instance, that some of our students' first-choice universities processed their final offers. Students who are preparing for their first significant assessments as sixth formers are still awaiting the outcomes of various GCSE marking reviews, and heads of department are busily writing department reports aimed at identifying the lessons to be drawn from the latest round of public examination results. So far, the key lesson to be learnt from the GCSE English language results is that in non-selective schools at least, it remains quite difficult to predict which exact grade students will finish on, with so many marks resting on 2 or more pieces of extended writing that require some kind of creative or improvised thought to be generated in timed conditions, especially where the top performance bands on most mark schemes are not enormously different in qualitative terms from those of the band below, and where examiners are typically placing those answers within a band on best fit principles, often with reference to exemplars from previous series that are intended to give an impression of what level of performance in descriptive writing or transactional writing might imply that the candidate is likely to finish on. Listen carefully to these 2 lines from the marking criteria for composition that appear on the writing paper that our Year 11 students had to attempt this year. For content and structure, examiners should award a candidate between 14 and 16 marks for producing description that features content that is complex, engaging, and effective. Structure that is secure, well-balanced, and carefully managed for deliberate effect. By contrast, writing that doesn't quite meet the standard for the top band and which should be placed in the band below only requires content that is developed, engaging, and effective. Structure that is well managed with some choices made for deliberate effect. In the abstract, there is not a lot of qualitative difference between an 11-mark and a 16-mark response. Does a secure structure demonstrate a higher level of skill than a well-managed structure? I'm not so sure it does. It becomes a little bit clearer, however, when one actually reads an 11-mark answer and a 16-mark answer side by side. But examiners essentially have a legitimate discretionary range here of 6 marks to accommodate their judgment. Whenever our centre succeeds in having a grade uprated as the result of a marking review, it is nearly always because the discretionary judgment that the examiner arrived at had been unreasonable, usually where an extended piece of creative writing had been banded too low. Grade boundaries here make little difference to outcomes if answers are being placed in the wrong performance bands. Consequently, heads of English routinely spend much of their summer holidays, as I did this year, reading through student exam scripts and trying to ascertain precisely which apparently reasonable judgments might in fact be deemed to fall outside reasonableness upon review, without seeking to discredit the whole system of exam marking upon which so much of our educational through flow depends. So, we will be requesting over the next few weeks copies of our best students' work to analyse, trying to work out how many of our strongest performers achieved their grades by following our departmental advice or by ploughing their own furrow in the exam room, because you can never be quite sure until you see it there in black and white. It will be interesting to see what the recalled scripts reveal. Tonight, however, we will be exploring literacy in a somewhat different context as we examine non-formal learning scenarios in Tanzanian homes. And I'm pleased to introduce Kate Fox, a former teaching colleague of mine back in the early days of the 21st century and a fellow survivor of the Y2K bug, who will be telling us all about her journey from the discussion in the classroom to educational research, the findings of her literacy field research in Tanzania, and how Tanzanian schools approach the teaching of primary literacy. So we'll be asking, what does the Tanzanian education system look like? How should we understand the relationship between literacy and development? And how can educational research make a lasting difference to the lives of its subjects? Kate has worked in education for 20 years as a teacher, teacher trainer, and now researcher and international development practitioner. Her own research work explores parental support for young children's literacy learning in rural Tanzanian communities, and she received the 2024 British Educational Research Association Prize for her dissertation entitled Building Bridges or Barriers, a study of home, community, and school literacy practices in rural Tanzania. Kate has previously worked for UNESCO, the Institute of Education at UCL, and is currently an education advisor for Tanzanian early childhood charity Ed UK Aid. And I'm delighted to say that Kate joins us on the line now. Good evening, Kate, and thank you for joining us on Teachers Talk Radio tonight, the home of education conversation.
Hi, Chris. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure for me to be here.
It's great to speak to you, Kate. And we first met about 17 years ago, I think it is now.
We did. Yeah, we were erstwhile colleagues. Yeah, that's right.
Well,
yeah, we've lived to tell the tale.
And then you were teaching at a primary school in South London.
I was, yeah. And I believe that you were in the secondary part of that primary, because it was an all through at that point.
That's right. Yep, the all-through school in South London. So what was your experience of primary teaching, Kate, and what prompted your move from classroom teaching into education and international development research?
Well, so I started my career when I finished university. I did a degree in politics, and both of my parents are teachers. And so naturally I said, I really don't want to be a teacher. And what prompted my teaching career was teaching English as a foreign language. So I did that for about 5 years in a few different countries, and realized as I was doing that actually I really loved teaching, and was good at it, and wanted to work with children and facilitate the learning process and understand more about it. So that's how I started. And then I was always very interested in traveling. So I think the move, I suppose, from education to international development maybe felt quite natural in some ways. But yeah, I mean, I have always been very interested in education. So in some ways, so the work I do now, it's international development work, but it's all education based. I don't do any work in any other sector within that field. So I've always worked in education. So for me, in some ways, it hasn't really felt like a big jump, really.
And what was the primary school education landscape like when you finished your training and entered your first job, Kate?
So I did my training in Oxford, and I got my first job in London, and that was in about 2009. So it was just before the new curriculum that was introduced in 2014. So I left teaching, I think I left teaching in the UK in 2015. So it was the beginning, I think, of real kind of data-driven teaching, and the use of specifically in the school that I was in, but the use of metrics to really kind of understand where children were, and using different in the school that I used to work in, there were statisticians, for example, whose job it was to kind of deep dive into that data. And I think that was something that was fairly new in education, and it's something that I have seen hugely expand in the last kind of 10 years or so. So yes, I mean, I really enjoyed it. My first year as a teacher was hard. I think everybody's was, but yeah, I loved it. I loved working with children. I think quite an important part of my formation as a teacher was the fact that I was working in an academy, and they were quite new actually at that point. I know they're really common now, and it's probably, I mean, I don't know the statistics on this, but I would imagine it's harder to find not an academy school than an academy one in the UK. But yeah, so this was my formative years as a teacher in the UK.
What did literacy learning look like in an inner city primary school in London at this point, Kate?
So it was and it remains even more so. It was phonics based. So children would start, there was something called Letters and Sounds, which was the government's first recommendations for, it was a phonics curriculum effectively. And looking at a lot of phonics curriculums now, they are really, really similar still to Letters and Sounds. And I think the Letters and Sounds document came out just before I started teaching. So 2007, something like that. And it's breaking, so it's a curriculum which uses phonemes as the basis of words, and you teach children discrete phonetic sounds, and you get them to build those into words. It's called synthetic phonics, and synthetic is a good word for it, because it's not a very kind of organic way of teaching reading. So in the sense that it's there is a stepped curriculum, so children start with 6 letters, and they use those to make very simple words, and you do a lot of practice with reading those phonemes initially, and then linking those to graphemes, which are basically letters, what letters look like. So you have the phonemes, what they sound like, and the graphemes, and you link those together for children, and then you use those building blocks to kind of start making bigger words and sentences and that kind of thing. And then you introduce something called tricky words. So this is words that are phonetically undecodable, and as you all know, as a English teacher, Chris, there's quite a lot of those. So yes, it was it worked for a lot of children. The reason that it was introduced is because there was a review, I don't know exactly when it was, but a lot of children were leaving primary school not being able to read, and transitioning into secondary school not being able to read. And it was felt that phonics, as it's called, synthetic phonics, was the best way to ensure that most children left primary school being able to read and being able to write.
And how did this practice in the primary school classroom, Kate, inform your interest in literacy later on? How did it push you towards the route that you subsequently took?
So, I mean, I think I've always been interested in not really literacy, but reading, and how children learn how to read. Because it's always struck me that phonics is synthetic, and you know, reading maybe has a more organic way of happening in children's lives. So I mean, that's sort of influenced my later work, I suppose. But yeah, I'm very interested actually in how children learn how to read, and also how reading is taught, because it's quite interesting when you compare education policy in different countries. There's actually, you may have heard of the reading wars, and reading is taught very differently in different countries. So the way that children learn how to read looks different. It's cultural, I think, and it's political as well.
Yeah, certainly interesting what you say about the word literacy. Both myself and my current headmaster have a kind of aversion to the word literacy. We'd like to think it kind of implies a surface level, doesn't it? A surface level of understanding rather than the kind of deeper richness that we want from reading.
Absolutely. And it is that richness that often gets lost, I think, unfortunately. But in classrooms when children are learning how to read, and that is because of synthetic phonics. But when I'm talking about literacy, I'm sorry, because it's a really, really contested term, especially in the fields that I'm looking at and researching. But what I mean when I say literacy is use of printed materials, so reading and writing, basically, and what people do with those printed materials.
Yeah, I think it's quite important to establish that fairly
early. It is, yeah.
I'm having
as will become apparent. Yeah, sorry, Chris.
I'm having nightmare flashbacks to delivering kind of very specifically focused spelling, punctuation, and grammar lessons.
Yes, oh my God.
50 minutes teaching people how to use a colon, and then they get it wrong the very next lesson.
Yeah, SPAG. Yes, that's right. I didn't mention SPAG, but yeah. So, I mean, SPAG is another example of this highly synthetic way of teaching. It presumes, I think, that you can squash language into like chunks that are teachable. Well, you know, it does, because that's what a curriculum is. But like you say, it's the depth and the richness of language is lost, I think, to a degree. So, yeah.
Yeah, some chunks are more appetizing than others, aren't they?
Well, some chunks are easily measurable. I think that's another issue. You know, it's quite easy to measure whether a child can. So they still do a test in reception, synthetic phonics test, and that's used then that's baseline data for schools to be able to understand whether children have made progress in literacy, whether they can read how many phonetic symbols they can read. So, but it, you know, that can't measure. It's a proxy for does a children understand? It's a proxy for reading and being able to read. But I think it's also a very difficult thing to ask teachers to measure as well. In some ways, it's quite a hard thing to capture.
I think you're right about that. It seems to cause a lot of anguish, perhaps more anguish than we really require in our classrooms sometimes. And you moved from London then, Kate, to going and setting up a school in Tanzania. Am I right about that?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I did.
Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So I moved to, I think this was in about 2014 or 15. And I moved to Dar es Salaam, which is the largest city in Tanzania. It's not the capital, but it's the largest city. And I opened so there was an existing nursery school that asked me to create their primary school. So I opened a school for them. So the school is still there, which is good. So yeah, it was a very interesting experience.
And what particular interesting moments could you share with us? What were your pupils like? What were the spaces like that they were working in?
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was fantastic. I had a really, really good time. I was the head teacher, and the school got bigger as the children kind of progressed through the year groups. So we started with a year 1 class, and then I was there for 3 years altogether. So when I left, those children were in year 4. and it felt in lots of ways like an English primary school. The curriculum was very similar. We based it on the UK curriculum, but we would do things like our wet plays, for example, in rainy season. You couldn't go outside because it was a tropical rainstorm. So there were lots of things that did look different. The class sizes were slightly bigger, but not too big, actually. It was a lovely experience, actually. Very nice, yeah.
And where did you draw your staff from in your startup year?
So we had, in our startup year, I didn't teach for the first year, and there were a couple of teachers who were there already. So we moved them up from nursery. And some of the teachers were from, I think one of the teachers was from Germany, one was from Ireland, and one was from the UK. So it was a mix of Tanzanian teachers and expat teachers as well.
And in terms of how you agreed what curriculum to deliver, you've said you based it in part on the UK curriculum that you were familiar with already. What kind of concessions or changes did you make for the fact that you weren't teaching in the United Kingdom?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of our so it was. I think back on this now, and I think that I probably made some mistakes. So things like we didn't really cover Kiswahili because the medium of instruction in the UK was the medium of instruction there was English rather than Swahili. So we probably should have done more classes in Swahili and maybe attempted to be bilingual actually rather than purely English for reasons of the education system. So a lot of these children would then be going into Tanzanian secondary schools. But we looked a lot at and we changed the foundation subjects. So obviously the content of the history and the geography curriculum looked very different. But otherwise, so we also did things like we focused a lot more in science, things like environmental work, and obviously our social geography looked different as well, and our the version of civic studies that we were doing, that was kind of taken from the environment, the context that we were setting this school up in. So for example, there was a big issue with plastic waste in Dar, and a lot of people would throw things out of cars and things like that. So we did a lot of work on things like different kinds of materials and how they degrade over time or how they don't. So we would sort of take a lot of we would use the context basically to try and create a curriculum that was more meaningful for Tanzanian children rather than English children. So it didn't look completely the same. So things like art as well. We would study Tanzanian artists and African artists rather than English artists. So, we plucked out the bits of, I should say that we plucked out the bits of the English curriculum that were useful to us and left some of the bits that weren't really very appropriate. So.
Thank you for explaining that for us. And you moved on from this to working for UNESCO. How did that come about?
Yeah, so I left Tanzania. So I have two young children. They're 4 and 6. And I left Tanzania 6 years ago because I was pregnant with my first daughter. And I started working for UNESCO when she was about 1 or 2. So I took a few years out. And I had started, when she was 1, I had started a master's at IOE because I had decided that I wanted to understand better how education kind of works within international development organizations. And that was inspired really through my time in Tanzania. So I actually applied initially to be an intern at UNESCO. So I worked for the Institute for Lifelong Learning, and I liked it so much, and they liked me. So they offered me contracts after that. So that's how I started working there. So that's and in some ways I was quite lucky because it was during the pandemic, and but I was at home with two very small children, but I was able to work there because they all of the contracts were distance contracts. So yeah, so I was lucky in that respect.
What kind of project work were you working on for them?
So the institute, I don't know if you know the Institute of Lifelong Learning, but so this is where my interest in non-formal learning came from. So they look at, initially it was so it's based in Hamburg, and it's part of UNESCO, and it's the only part of UNESCO that has a specific mandate, and their mandate used to be continuing or adult education, but it's now lifelong learning. So that starts obviously from when children are babies, and sometimes prior to that. So in utero kind of learning that children do, all the way to the end of people's lives. So I worked on initially a family literacy project. So family literacy is intergenerational learning. So the kinds of learning that people do at home and in other non-formal contexts. But this family literacy learning was looking at what was happening in the home and ways in which parents interact with their children and ways that children learn from the adults around them, and also how in some family literacy programs adults also learn literacy. So illiterate adults will learn literacy at the same time as their children as well. So the program that I was working on specifically was for the Commonwealth of Learning, and they had set up a project to help parents with literacy and numeracy related activities to support learning, to support school-based learning. And that project was for about 3 or 4 months. And then I worked on another project with them, and that was creating an online course for teacher professional development. So for adult literacy educators working in Global Alliance of Literacy countries. And the Global Alliance of Literacy is the countries which have the lowest level of literacy. I think there's about 20 countries in the Global Alliance of Literacy. So that course that I was writing for them, the Teacher Professional Development course, so that course then goes to various different governments and is then filtered through their civil service, and then it will be rolled out across the country. So I think it's being used now in Morocco, Cote d'Ivoire, Pakistan as well, a couple of other countries. Yeah, so again, really, really interesting work. And I love the Teacher Professional Development course. One thing I didn't say, actually, something that I used to do in Tanzania was also teacher training, so new teacher training. And so I had done a lot of teacher professional development work already, so writing courses and things like that, but at school level rather than organizational level. So yeah, this is very interesting, but it didn't quite capture me in the way that family literacy programs did. And this is where all my work comes from, really. And I think maybe one of the reasons it captured me was that, and I became so interested in it, was because I at home was watching my children grow up, and then going to school and sort of thinking really carefully and seeing in real time the links, what children were learning at home with me, and whether teachers were kind of engaging with that, and where the barriers were between home and school as well in terms of learning and what that looked like.
I think you've read my mind, Kate. I was just about to ask you, actually, if the process of becoming a parent had, in fact, changed anything about the way you thought about teaching in the early years in particular. It's a
Yes,
debate we
it
often
has.
hear, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, definitely. I think it sort of it fleshes it out for you, if you see what I mean. Especially, I mean, what I'm really interested in is the overlap between schools and homes and why that does and doesn't happen and how that is, whether that is leveraged, I suppose, whether the home is leveraged. And yes, as a teacher, I've always been on the other side, and I've always, having parents' evenings and things like that. And I had no kind of understanding of where parents came from. And I think also, your teacher training, there is nothing about parents and how to engage with parents and the importance of parents and homes. And that just, it really becoming a parent, and especially when my older daughter started school, it completely changed my perspective, I think, on learning itself, what learning is and where it happens as well, and who does it, and what a teacher is too. Specifically for literacy in my research, but these are quite deep questions that I think should be explored more deeply by teachers. Actually, I mean, they don't have time to do that, but yeah, they are important questions. So.
It's a good point, I think. And obviously, you've had quite a significant range of different experiences in different contexts as a consequence of teaching in London and then the work you've done, development work, plus the founding of the school in Tanzania. But what wider perspective have you managed to gain on international education, Kate, as a result of your postgraduate study at the Institute of Education?
Yeah, so I started my master's. I took a really long time to do it. I took 4 years to do it, and that's because I was working and also because I had children who were quite little. Yeah, I think what it does, it's a process of. So by the time I had started, I had been a teacher for probably about 10, 15 years, something like that. And, you're trained, and I'd set up a school and I trained teachers, and I thought, okay, well, this is going to teach me a lot about international development, but not really that much about education because I know so much about it. And I just could not have been more wrong about that. And actually, I think the process of doing something where you are reading hundreds of journal articles and different perspectives, it forces you to become more critical about what you're doing. And I think a master's is basically a process of slowly unpicking everything that you think you know and understand about teaching and education. And that is what happened to me. So, it didn't just change my perspective. I think it's sort of like I've had to relearn what I think education is as well, and what it's for, what its purpose is, because you're forced to ask those kinds of questions. And I think another thing it's helped me to understand is the nested nature of education systems. So, what happens in a classroom reflects a much, much bigger process of decision making that is not happening at school level. It's not even happening necessarily at policy level. It might be happening at OECD level. So, and I'm talking there about PISA and TIMS and PEARLS. I don't know if you probably do know these things, but all of these things have an influence on what I do in my classroom. So it's I would recommend it to everyone. It was a really hugely thought-provoking process, and I think actually because I have taught since finishing the masters as well, because I still love teaching, so I will occasionally teach, and I think it makes you a better teacher actually, because you are thinking on a much deeper level about what you're doing and why you're doing it as well, and whose purpose is it serving. And yeah.
Well, thanks for that overview, Kate. There are some really quite powerful observations there about your experience in the classroom and what more you learnt from the process of studying for the master's course that you took. In the second part of the show, I'd like us to look a little bit more closely at the context of teaching, learning, and the family in the Tanzanian culture that you were visiting, and to consider how we might think of literacy learning as a social practice. Does that sound okay?
That sounds brilliant, yeah.
Excellent. We'll be right back after this.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Introducing Reading Solutions UK. Home to Dreambox Reading Plus, the online reading development programme, improving outcomes for students and schools nationwide. Create stronger readers in your school from Key Stage 2 to beyond GCSE, using Reading Plus's evidence-based adaptive technology. Reading Plus accurately assesses your students' skills gaps and places them on a personalised learning pathway, built to accelerate their strengths and improve on their areas for development. You can try the program with a free 4-week pilot today. Search Reading Solutions UK to find their website and request your free pilot today.
How can you show your students the opportunities that await them? How can you fuel their aspirations and motivate them to achieve? Futurum Careers provides a wealth of stimulating resources aimed at encouraging 14 to 19-year-olds to pursue careers in STEM and SHAPE. We help you to show your students what they can aim for and how. From articles to activity sheets, animations to podcasts, all our resources align with Gatsby benchmarks and are free for you and your students to download. Visit futurumcareers.com and subscribe today. Futurum Careers, helping teachers to inspire the next generation.
Get set for the year ahead with the Bloomsbury Education Back to School sale. Save 30% on all Bloomsbury education books until 30th September. From the very best in research-led practice to trusted advice on inclusivity, behaviour and curriculum design, we've got something for everyone. Visit bloomsbury.com/B2S sale to shop now and save 30%. Bloomsbury Education, books for every step of your teaching journey.
Teachers, mark your calendars for BetUK 2025, the world's biggest EdTech event. Join over 30,000 educators at the Excel London from the 22nd to the 24th of January. Discover the latest EdTech innovations, network with peers and access hundreds of hours of CPD. Did we mention it's 100% free for educators? Whether you're looking for inspiration or practical tools to enhance your teaching, BET has it all. Don't miss this opportunity to shape the future of education. Register today at uk.betshow.com. That's uk.betshow.com.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
The government has published its call for evidence for its wide-ranging curriculum review. In a feature by Schools Week, details of the process are given. The consultation will last for 8 weeks, until November the 22nd. According to the Department for Education, questions are going to be as open as possible, and they welcome responses from all interested parties, including young people and parents. An interim report is scheduled to be published in early 2025, with a final report and recommendations in autumn 2025. The chair of the review said straightforward changes could happen quickly, although government has committed to giving schools a year's notice for major curriculum and assessment reforms. The review also makes clear positives but states there are parts of the system that require improvement, particularly SEND and those pupils from poorer backgrounds. Some potential outcomes are also listed, which could include ways to alleviate some of the pressure and constraints on learners and educators, reduce the assessment burden and consider well-being, and making sure the curriculum is inclusive and accessible for all. The review may also offer commentary on the impact of accountability measures. The chair of the review, Professor Becky Francis, also told Schools Week that the biggest challenge for the review was to ensure its reforms did no harm or have unintended consequences. Alongside the call for evidence, the government has also published a study of curriculum subject trends over time to aid our evidence-led conversation, they said. Some of the data shows significantly higher numbers of students taking Maths A-level, art continuing to thrive at GCSE, but design and technology subjects faring worst over time. Further details of the statistics can be found on the Schools Week website. The Metro News website covers a story about a state secondary school which has made it into the final 3 for the World's Best School Prize for supporting healthy lives. The award was founded by the T4 Education and celebrates schools around the world that really understand their role in fostering healthy habits, behaviours, knowledge and skills. The Hindu Faith School is for pupils aged 11 to 19, and whilst their ethos is drawn from the Vaishnavist tradition of the faith, they are fully inclusive. Anyone who wants to apply to the school is able to. As well as following a traditional curriculum, the free school also teaches extra subjects like yoga, philosophy, ethics and Sanskrit. Their website says, "We put an equal emphasis on the highest academic achievement alongside the development of character and spiritual insight." The 2 other schools in the final are based in Italy and Singapore. The BBC Wales website reports that teachers could be asked to swear an oath against inappropriate relationships with pupils. A motion due to be considered by Flintshire Council could see teachers and school staff pledge in front of a manager not to form intimate relationships with students. It follows the court case of a former head teacher jailed for 17 years after being found guilty of sexual abuse. Education Union NASUWT said introducing an oath would show shocking contempt for teachers and would only bring the teaching profession into disrepute. ASCL has said it would be willing to discuss the proposal. The BBC National News website reports on new guidance for disabled students. The Equality and Human Rights Commission has published new guidance setting out what universities must do to comply with laws. Universities must proactively support disabled students rather than wait for them to ask for help. It follows the death of Bristol University student Natasha Abrahart, whose parents contributed to the new guidance. Universities must now actively seek out and adopt best practice and show real commitment to understanding and meeting diverse needs. Finally, Schools Week reports that some pupils with additional needs will be able to listen to white noise or music during their exams this year. Schools will also be able to use mental health support service referral letters to apply for extra support to ensure young people aren't disadvantaged by long waiting lists. The changes are included in the updated JCQ guidance on adjustments schools can request. SENCOs can now apply for pupils who are classed as having a substantial impairment to listen to music or white noise. This would apply to those with social, emotional and mental health needs or with a sensory impairment such as tinnitus. These adjustments apply to GCSE, A-level, BTEC and T-level qualifications. Schools must make sure devices playing the music or white noise cannot be connected to the internet and the playlist must be checked. The change meaning schools can use a referral to CAMS or NHS trusts has also been welcomed as waiting lists for specialist services are growing. Full details of all the changes can be found on the JCQ website. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
Welcome back to our show on literacy and non-formal learning in Tanzania with former teacher and current researcher Kate Fox. In the first section of the show, Kate described the nature of her fascinating journey from classroom teaching to research practices and the variety of contexts within which she has encountered literacy learners. Now, Kate, for the benefit of all of our listeners, I wonder if you might map out for us the Tanzanian social and cultural contexts within which early literacy learning happens. But First, Kate, what prompted you to direct your research career towards learning and education in Tanzania?
Thanks, Chris. I think it was probably because when I lived there for 5 years, and I understood to some degree how parents, what they did at home with their children, and some of the cultural forms of art and literacy, how this contributed to what children were learning in the classroom and the way that they were behaving, and so that was why Tanzania, because I felt like I understood the Tanzanian education system, how it worked, and also to a degree had experience of the social culturally how Tanzanian society worked, and the relationship that had with the education system to a degree, and I was really interested in non-formal learning mostly because of my experience at UNESCO, which helped me to understand literacy and learning in a slightly different way, as something that was just a feature of being human rather than something that happened in schools. And so UNESCO, the Institute of Lifelong Learning, is very heavily influenced by a thinker called Paulo Freire, who is a Brazilian teacher. And he talked a lot about learners not being vessels that are filled up, but rather learning is discursive. It's a discursive practice where learners build meaning through pedagogy. And so this really kind of affected the way that I started to think as well about learning as well. I mean, he was working mostly with in adult literacy, but I started to apply some of those concepts to early literacy as well, and children, because very often children are treated as objects rather than subjects, I feel, in the learning space in schools. So this is the reason. Geographically I was interested in Tanzania because of the fact that I'd lived there, and I was very interested, and I loved the culture. And in terms of theoretically, I was interested in non-formal learning because of my experience and work at UIL as well.
And what does the Tanzanian primary education system typically look like?
I mean, it's very similar to the English system. It's but there are certain differences to do with resources and materials. So there are far fewer teachers, for example. In your average Tanzanian school or average Tanzanian classroom, there will be up to 100 children in a class. That's quite normal. And in state schools, private schools are a bit different to that. So there are, it's actually just really recently gone through a curriculum change. So, but I can speak to what it used to look like sort of 2 or 3 years ago. So there were 2 preschool years, and then children would start school at the age of 6, and they would go until what we call year 6. So they're about 10 or 11 years old. Then they would take an exam, and if they passed that exam, they would then go on to secondary school. But there's actually quite a high rate of attrition between primary and secondary. So I don't know what the exact figures are, but there are quite a lot of out of school children from the age of 11 and 12. So not all children do transition to secondary school. So in terms of content, it looks very similar. There's Kiswahili, which is like learning English language or literacy. So children learn to read and write in Kiswahili in primary. So the language of instruction is most often Kiswahili in state schools, Kiswahili, and then in private schools it's quite often English language of instruction, and that's for lots of different reasons. And then there is a transition to secondary, and secondary school is in English in state school, and then tertiary education is also in English. And this is as a result of Tanzania being a former protectorate colony of the UK. So, yeah.
And how is schooling viewed culturally, generally?
It's positively viewed. It's seen as an instrument to improve life chances, much like it is in the UK. So parents send their children to school expecting them to learn to read and write and then to get a job, preferably a white collar job. So, but there are many issues still in the Tanzanian school system. So quite often there will be children out of school. Again, I'm not sure exactly of the statistics around that, but also there was so the curriculum was changed around 2014-15 because new testing was introduced, and the government realised that actually the levels of children's literacy levels and numeracy levels are lower than they should be, but comparatively higher compared to other East African countries, but they're still quite low. And I think that that's mostly as a result of the material circumstances of most children in schools, which is a very high pupil to teacher ratio. But as I say, it is generally perceived positively, I would say, and as important. And it is the law, for example, and it's quite a recent law that parents have to send their children in to school. So it's literacy and schooling are an important indices for development in Tanzania. So Tanzania is looking to become a middle-income country soon, as part of its 2030 vision. And one of the indices that it needs to achieve in order to become a middle-income country is level of schooling, and also general literacy level of the population. And that's taken through exam results. Excuse me.
So does the government have a particular plan in how to drive up standards of literacy in the country?
Yeah, there's various plans and policies that exist. So this curriculum change that I refer to, which happened in 2014, there were it was called at the time a literacy crisis, and there was a lot of noise about it in newspapers, and people, understandably got very upset and angry because numeracy and literacy levels had fallen, and a lot of children were leaving school not being able to read and write, or their literacy numeracy levels were lower. When I say literacy, what I mean is Kiswahili. Kiswahili test results, basically. So they test reading, writing, and maths. And there were a lot of government policies which were introduced, but also donor institutions. So there was, which work through government and with government. So an example of that would be what used to be called DFID and is now called the Foreign Office. They have a lot of education policies which are still active in Tanzania, but they work through government policies. And so an example of this would be a program called Big Results Now. And they work almost like quangos through these programs where they are going into schools and they're working with schools and ward education officers, district education officers, to introduce and implement policies that will improve literacy and numeracy results. So there's a range of policies that kind of exist at different levels, and you have different organisations that are working with government to affect these kinds of changes. So there's lots and lots of different policies that are generally kind of pulling in the same direction, which is towards kind of an accountability type system. So something which looks very similar to what we have in the UK in terms of Ofsted and accountability through data and measurement, that kind of thing.
Well, it sounds like there's certainly a lot of policy activity going on.
Yes, there is.
In terms of your research, though, Kate, you identify the family home as a space characterised by non-formal learning. I wondered if you might be able to say a little bit about what you mean by non-formal learning in this context and how this might be identified.
Yeah, so I'm using it in a very kind of colloquial way. So there are very important distinctions between informal, non-formal learning, but for the purposes of this research, non-formal here, I'm using it in the sense of learning which isn't happening in institutions, so in schools, basically. There's no curriculum necessarily. It's very organic kind of learning which happens in homes, so between people.
And how might we recognise that if we saw it in terms of examples?
So, as an example, when I did my research in a town called Mikandani in southern Tanzania. The region is called Mtwara. And there, a lot of children are working for their parents. So, I mean, this is really not unusual in Tanzania for children to be working in the informal economy. So children who are quite young, sort of 3, 4, 5 years old, they are working with their parents. So their parents might have a small shop outside their house. And what children are doing are things like, so parents will show them these things, and then they are doing things like bundling lots of vegetables or lots of fish together in order to sell them. They are talking to customers, they are exchanging coins, and they are doing things like reading money, reading notes, reading coins. They are, so they're sorting, they're counting, that kind of thing. A parent told me about, so he was a tailor, and he told me that he would work with his 6 and 7 year old, or, it's not really considered to be working, it's just like helping out, I suppose. And they would do things like write down measurements next to customers' names in books. So all of these things they're being modelled by older actors in their environment. So in this case, parents, but it could also be siblings, older siblings, and they're copying them and they're doing these things. So these things are actually what we would call numeracy activities. It's like sorting stuff and counting it and bundling into threes. So that would be one example. Another might be play with older siblings. So quite a lot of parents told me things like older siblings would be teaching younger siblings to read. They would be teaching them directionality of print. They would, I saw quite often gates, which are painted black in villages, being used as blackboards. So children kind of scratching stuff on these gates, or using them as almost like blackboards, so that they're sort of almost like recreating school for younger children. So sociologically, you would call this a form of teaching. It's a form of kind of socio-cultural patterning for children to so that they then find it easier almost to go into school and to learn. But sometimes it literally looks like teaching, as in writing something on this gate and other children copying it, or teaching children to read. But these aren't in a curriculum. They're not formalized in any way, but they are happening. So this is what I mean when I say informal or non-formal types of learning that are happening, not just in the home, but also in the community as well. So, I mean, there are so many examples that I found in my research, even things like play as well, or use of digital practices, I called them. So things like listening to the radio, or teaching older generations, so teaching them how to use mobile phones, or watching videos with subtitles, things like that. So these are all very small incremental bits of literacy and use of printed materials and use of numeracy and literacy activities that are going on in homes and communities.
So what kind of activities did you choose to exclude from this kind of mix of very valuable learning activities that you've already described?
How do you mean exclude? Sorry.
I'm just thinking there's quite a lot of stuff that could be classed as learning on one level. So how did you decide what to include, I suppose, and what not to include, if that makes sense?
So what I was looking for was any sort of interaction with printed material. So that had meaning and purpose for the people who were doing it. So anything that, and it was specifically children that I was interested in. So the way that I found this out was through interviewing parents and asking them to complete like a survey of any interaction that they were having with children, or children were having with printed material. So I think it would be very easy to say, yes, they're learning this, but what I was interested in was what are children doing with printed material that is meaningful for them. So this kind of opens up things like cooking, use of the backs of packets for cooking and things like that. But I wasn't so interested in things that weren't so there is so I talk about literacy as social practice as part of my research, but there is a strand of this theory that talks about something called multiliteracy. So that's things like pictures, emojis would be a good example. So it is a form of printed text in a way, but I wasn't really going that deep, I suppose, into so symbols, I suppose, like semiotic symbols. I was interested in printed materials with Kiswahili written on it. So nothing like tables or other kind of forms of organizing writing or ideas, I suppose, if you see what I mean.
I think so. I think that's quite a helpful distinction, actually, because again, one could be tempted, I suppose, to view quite a lot of social interactions as learning experiences.
They are.
And in terms of how these manipulations with the printed material, which seems to be the key idea here, you're exploring, what relationships existed between teachers, in inverted commas, and learners in these family spaces? What did you observe?
What existed in terms of relationships? Do you mean how were they related to each other, the people?
Yeah, so I'm thinking, who were the teachers and who were the learners, and what characterized their roles as you observed them? Yeah,
that's such a good question. So I can only really speak about the play that I witnessed, because a lot of the research was based on some of what parents told me as well. So it's sort of secondhand observation, if you see what I mean. So, but I saw myself, children playing together, and using materials around them for writing. So, for example, these blackboards that I've told you about that were on gates, but also things like, so when they were playing, a lot of the interaction that they're having with each other is often sometimes in two languages. So they are not always speaking Kiswahili. They are also speaking Makonde, which is the local language. So they're involved in very complex games which involve things like negotiating. I don't know if you've ever watched children play with each other, but there's a lot of negotiation which has to happen in order to establish rules and how things might work in a game. And quite often I saw children speaking in two different languages. I speak really terrible French and okay Swahili, and it's quite difficult to negotiate between these two different languages. So that's not printed material necessarily, but there is a relationship between language and literacy. And so these kinds of interactions which children are having with their peers are quite under-recognized actually in research. In the research in this area, there's not a lot of work that's been done on how children are kind of using these practices in schools, or whether they're being recognized as something that's a literacy form. But also, one of the things that I found very interesting actually was the role of siblings in families. And siblings are in this specific geographical area, siblings are doing quite a lot of work with younger children. And actually sometimes teachers were saying to me, I interviewed about 12 teachers in the 6 communities that I was working in, and they will quite often use older siblings as a way to support younger children with their literacy, so their school literacy, like reading and writing, especially in cases where there are illiterate parents. And this is actually happening quite often. But again, there's really not very much research on this at all. So these informal practices which are being used, I'm saying in my work that actually, they're being used already, but it could be something that's worth exploring, because children are interacting all the time as part of their social community context with lots of different people who are doing lots of different kinds of things with them. So it's worth thinking about who those people are and what they are actually doing with children in their daily lives.
And how do schools regard this non-formal learning, Kate?
So one of my research questions actually, so I had 2 main research questions. One of them was first of all to understand some of those practices, and the second, and to observe them and to try and find out a bit more about them, because I knew that they were happening because I have been living in Tanzania and I had seen some of them. Excuse me. And the second question was to find out, okay, so these things are happening. Are they being used by schools, and what do schools think about them? And actually, schools. So I'll just tell you very briefly that the kind of areas or domains I found these practices in. So, most relevantly for your question, in religion. So, quite a lot of children in this area go to a madrasa, which is a Muslim school, Islamic school, where children learn to read and write in Arabic, and also in play and through sibling interactions. And I've spoken a little bit about that, and also through their digital practices. So looking at, whether children are using mobile phones or if they're watching TV and things like that. And I was surprised to find that teachers were really dismissive of them actually, and they weren't using them or recognizing them at all. So as an example, children are going to these madrasas. There's one in almost every rural village. The places where I was extremely rural, and some of them were kind of 20 kilometers away from a main road. The infrastructure is really, really limited. But there is always a madrasa, and a lot of the children that the parents that I interviewed were being sent to this madrasa. And some of these children, they're 4 or 5 years old. They come to school and they can read and write in Arabic already. but teachers say things like, they're not really interested in what children have learned already. What they're interested in is whether they can read and write in Swahili. So, they say things like the languages that children are speaking. So I spoke to you before about these negotiation games and things like that, where children are translating. Children are not allowed to use their mother tongue in school. They're not allowed, because teachers think it makes reading and writing more difficult to teach. They consider Arabic to be a barrier, because they think it disrupts the learning process because the letters go the wrong way. And what they're more concerned about is, are they doing play as well. Teachers don't want children to play. They want them to take exercise books home and read and write in them. They consider these livelihood practices to be where they're helping their parents. They think they're a waste of time, and they need to be doing much more schoolwork. Basically, that's what they're interested in. So, and they're interested in it being in Kiswahili as well, not in Makonde, which they consider to be, that and Arabic, they think is a huge barrier to children's learning.
And were there any other systemic challenges posed by this relationship that you observed?
Yeah, so another issue, what's really valuable to teachers, and I think that there is definitely parallels to the UK system here, is, can children read and write in Swahili? And this is, I can understand why this is how teachers are measured too, and they're held accountable for that. And what children need to be able to do is to pass their examinations, and they have examinations in what would be year 3, so 4 years after preschool, which is the year that that I was looking at, and then again in year 6. And these are very high stakes examinations. If children don't pass this is not so true now, but if children don't pass their examinations, they will not go to secondary school. But their level of pass still dictates where they will. The examination has changed somewhat in that you can still go to secondary school, but it dictates how good the secondary school is that you'll go to. So there is a lot of pressure on teachers to channel children's literacy practices in a very specific way. So families who are not, and this actually looks like book reading most often. So all the parents that I spoke to, there was about 8 of them, said, all the teachers I spoke to said the way that parents can support literacy and families can support literacy needs to be book reading. They need to read books. They need to be doing writing and exercise books. So it's all kind of school type literacy that that's the expectation that children should be doing at home. And what they were saying was that parents and families who are not able to do this, so for example in this area there are a lot of illiterate families, they're very rural, there's high levels of poverty, and not all of them speak Kiswahili either. And when you talk to teachers about these families, they say things like, well, what do you expect? They're illiterate. How can they possibly support their children? They perceive big difficulties and barriers for children who come from these kinds of families. But what's not happening is that teachers are also not exploring the kind of practices that I've just talked about as a way of like a bridge, that could support these relationships between parents and teachers, because they see nothing of value within that household, within that family, that family is able to contribute, because they're not doing the kinds of literacy that's more valuable for passing exams. So you have a situation where children are not allowed to use those practices because they're not very valuable in school. And this is why I made the point about language and literacy. You will know that they're very closely connected. Children are not permitted to use their home language in school either. So they're coming into school, they have this wealth of experience maybe that they can bring into their literacy learning. So Arabic, Makonde, this kind of thing. They're not allowed to use any of it. And not just that, they are being told, this is detrimental and, it's bad, you're not allowed to use it. But also, at the same time, teachers are not kind of reaching out to parents and families to kind of explore some of these practices and what children are already doing. So you have a situation where there are families, I think, who are, they're just a bit stuck, really. They can't build those, the bridges aren't being built for them. They're not being supported by the schools, and they're not able to kind of meet schools where they are because schools just do not understand what's going on in the home as well. So, and ultimately the people who lose out are the children. So
it sounds like from what you've been explaining that the deficit narrative seems to be in the ascendant at the moment, and perhaps that's an area that you think should be ripe for change.
Yeah, absolutely. So as part of my, these kinds of things, you need to do a big literature review. So you look at all the reports and the literature around, academic literature around this subject. So I read, a lot of different academic journal articles, research that has happened in this area, and pretty consistently supportive, like quality home learning environments for early literacy looks like books and book-based activities and parent-led reading and writing activities. And they also look like, it's school activity going into the home rather than the home kinds of activities being done in school, if you see what I mean. So there's no consideration of what might happen in these homes, and rather what the research is suggesting is that children who are coming from these kinds of homes where they are rural, they have a second language which is not Kiswahili, they're from they have lower socioeconomic status, so they're poorer, and really importantly have lower levels of parental education. They're considered to be severely limited in how they support their children. And what I'm saying, so almost all the research says this, and what I'm saying is, well, maybe you need to look at it a slightly different way. And actually, literacy might look like something else. It might not look like reading a book. So if you look for different things, then maybe you will find that these parents are able to support their children, but just not in a way that looks like reading a book, basically.
Thank you, Kate. And in the final section of the show, we will explore a bit more precisely the methodology and findings of your research. So I'd like to just wrap it up here if we can for the moment. And we'll think about what your project has revealed about attitudes towards literacy and literacy learning in Tanzania. And we will be right back after this.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Introducing Reading Solutions UK. Home to Dreambox Reading Plus, the online reading development programme, improving outcomes for students and schools nationwide. Create stronger readers in your school from Key Stage 2 to beyond GCSE, using Reading Plus's evidence-based adaptive technology. Reading Plus accurately assesses your students' skills gaps and places them on a personalised learning pathway, built to accelerate their strengths and improve on their areas for development. You can try the program with a free 4-week pilot today. Search Reading Solutions UK to find their website and request your free pilot today.
How can you show your students the opportunities that await them? How can you fuel their aspirations and motivate them to achieve? Futurum Careers provides a wealth of stimulating resources aimed at encouraging 14 to 19-year-olds to pursue careers in STEM and SHAPE. We help you to show your students what they can aim for and how. From articles to activity sheets, animations to podcasts, all our resources align with Gatsby benchmarks and are free for you and your students to download. Visit futurumcareers.com and subscribe today. Futurum Careers, helping teachers to inspire the next generation.
Get set for the year ahead with the Bloomsbury Education Back to School sale. Save 30% on all Bloomsbury education books until 30th September. From the very best in research-led practice to trusted advice on inclusivity, behaviour and curriculum design, we've got something for everyone. Visit bloomsbury.com/B2S sale to shop now and save 30%. Bloomsbury Education, books for every step of your teaching journey.
Teachers, mark your calendars for BetUK 2025, the world's biggest EdTech event. Join over 30,000 educators at the Excel London from the 22nd to the 24th of January. Discover the latest EdTech innovations, network with peers and access hundreds of hours of CPD. Did we mention it's 100% free for educators? Whether you're looking for inspiration or practical tools to enhance your teaching, BET has it all. Don't miss this opportunity to shape the future of education. Register today at uk.betshow.com. That's uk.betshow.com.
Welcome back to the final part of our show on literacy and non-formal education in Tanzania with Kate Fox. So far, we've heard about Kate's experiences of working with literacy learners in a range of classroom and international development settings and learnt a bit about the national context within which Tanzanian literacy education sits. So in the final part of the show, I'd like us to look a little more closely at the findings of Kate's research. So, Kate, what did you principally discover that could be used to inform policy practice from your research?
So, I think that, first of all, I mean, it probably won't surprise you to this seems to be what all researchers say, but more research does need to be done. Like there's I could find very little research on informal or non-formal literacy practices that families and young children specifically are doing in their homes and communities, or engaging in their homes and communities. So there needs to be more research done on that. So, and I think once those practices become a bit more visible, then it might be easier to reframe what a quality or supportive home learning environment looks like for young children. So, and also, in terms of school practices, the fact that teachers and head teachers as well that I interviewed, and also NGO workers as well who were working on home and community programs in this area, they also don't see the potential of what families, rural, especially illiterate families, can offer their children. So if parents and families are already engaging in some of these practices, then it is possible that maybe we can work with literacy and parental and family support programs for young children and early literacy that don't look like parents reading books with children. Maybe it could be based on other printed materials that children are using as part of their everyday lives in communities. Because when you look at programs, so international development programs, education programs, they are almost entirely predicated on the kind of reading practices that we engage in the UK as families, which is book reading. And that is a cultural practice. It's something that is really, it's not necessarily done all the time in every Tanzanian family. So I think we need more research on these practices, because we need to find a way, the education international development community needs to find a way of making that support for families and for young children more contextual, to work with the context rather than introducing something that might not work and is not organic to it. So the reason I called the work Building Bridges is because I think that there is potential to use some of these practices to bridge what is currently a very distinct domains of school and homes and communities. And the idea being that you support then some of the most marginalized families to facilitate children's learning, and their literacy learning as well. But it's all based on a much wider view of what counts as literacy. So I come back again to the book reading. This is a very kind of typical activity which is recommended to parents, and it's also recommended to parents in Tanzanian research as well. But the reality is, rural, very poor, illiterate families, they just don't have access to books for lots of different reasons. So I think that there needs to be a bigger, wider conversation about what counts as literacy, and research done on that basis as well.
And how about the way literacy is tested when the children get to school? Are there any changes you think need to happen there?
I mean, so I presented this research actually to a UNICEF conference last week, and someone asked me, does that mean that I want to replace the school system, with this? And I think there's a role for testing literacy levels, but I think I see this as something that's more supportive rather than something that replaces what happens in schools, if you see what I mean. So I think, in a way, what I'm not saying is let's not test, or let's test something different. I'm saying let's maybe kind of reflect on how teachers, like what teachers are using for material or content, and maybe obviously this will have implications for testing, but I don't think it necessarily means that teachers won't be able to test children's literacy levels.
Is there also some scope for working with parents more closely too, to educating them perhaps in some of these
definitely
benefits that their children could gain from the experiences they're going through at home?
Yes, I think absolutely that's really, really key. So I think that, I mentioned to you in the first section of the programme that it surprises me now as a parent that there is not more focus on parents in teacher training. There's a lot of research, international research, suggests that actually parents and what happens in homes makes more of a difference to children's literacy outcomes than school does anyway. So yeah, I think that what parents do has the potential to totally change children's life courses and also school outcomes. I think that's almost considered to be a given now. So it baffles me that this is not, it feels like a really overlooked bit of children's life experience and children's learning experiences generally. So yeah, and I think that's not just true in Tanzania. I think that's also true in the UK as well. So yes, there's definitely potential. I think it needs to be integrated somehow into teacher training, because I think that's really the only way that you would actually make a difference to the ways that teachers kind of work with families.
If we think about the UK experience, though, we do have, of course, in many of our schools that haven't been absorbed into academy chains, the idea of the parent governor as a kind of overseer of what schools do. Do we have anything similar to that in Tanzania?
Yeah, there is. There's a committee, like a parent committee, that works with. So they're seen as a bridge between the parent community and the school. So yes, it does exist. But what is not happening, I suppose, is when you talk to these people, they will agree that, parents need to be supporting schools in very specific ways. What they're not asking is, well, what can schools do to support families, if you see what I mean? So the traffic is going one way. It's going from school to families rather than from families to schools.
Yeah, that certainly sounds like a complicated dialogue, doesn't it? If it's only going in one direction.
Yes. So it just means that schools are not really understanding still what's happening at home. I mean, it's complicated in Tanzania by the fact that there are just so many children in a class. So, teachers are having to deal with basically 200 parents if it's a class of, or 120 parents if it's a class of 60. So yeah, it's complicated. But I feel that if you were to do these things in a way that supports parents from the outset and doesn't kind of capitalize on these deficit narratives, or like the relationships are not formulated on these deficit narratives, then there's the potential that parents can do some of the work for you, I think. But there has to be that discussion between parents and teachers. And the parent governor thing, it doesn't work. It's not a sufficient mechanism to do that, I found, in this case, because there are parent governors here and they're not really fulfilling that function.
So more work to be done then.
Yes, always. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, listen, Kate, it's been great hearing from you this evening. It's been wonderful to hear your story, the outcomes of your research, and your enthusiasm for literacy education this evening. I think you've certainly given us all a clearer perspective upon the Tanzanian experience of literacy learning and alerted us all to the potential for non-formal educational practices to be given greater attention by researchers, classroom practitioners, and education policymakers. Where is this project likely to take you next, do you think?
Well, I'm starting a PhD on it next month. And the project that I work with in Tanzania, they're quite interested in using some of the research. So I'm hoping that some of it will become a bit more visible. So, in terms of academic articles, possibly. So also I'm hoping to use it to produce something like a toolkit, to make some of these practices a bit more visible. So I'm hoping it will be usable by teachers in Tanzania in some capacity.
Well, it's been great to catch up with you and
Yes.
hear how your research is making a difference to the ways in which literacy practice is studied and understood. So thank you very much for your contributions tonight, and we wish you the very best of luck for the next research project.
Thank you, Chris. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
The pleasure's been all ours, I'm sure, Kate.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks, Chris.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading!
Introducing Reading Solutions UK, home to Dreambox Reading Plus, the online reading development programme, improving outcomes for students and schools nationwide. Create stronger readers in your school from Key Stage 2 to beyond GCSE, using Reading Plus's evidence-based adaptive technology. Reading Plus accurately assesses your students' skills gaps and places them on a personalised learning pathway, built to accelerate their strengths and improve on their areas for development. You can try the programme with a free 4-week pilot today. Search Reading Solutions UK to find their website and request your free pilot today.
How can you show your students the opportunities that await them? How can you fuel their aspirations and motivate them to achieve? Futurum Careers provides a wealth of stimulating resources aimed at encouraging 14 to 19-year-olds to pursue careers in STEM and SHAPE. We help you to show your students what they can aim for and how. From articles to activity sheets, animations to podcasts, all our resources align with Gatsby benchmarks and are free for you and your students to download. Visit futurumcareers.com and subscribe today. Futurum Careers, helping teachers to inspire the next generation.
Get set for the year ahead with the Bloomsbury Education Back to School sale. Save 30% on all Bloomsbury education books until 30th September. From the very best in research-led practice to trusted advice on inclusivity, behaviour and curriculum design, we've got something for everyone. Visit bloomsbury.com/B2S sale to shop now and save 30%. Bloomsbury Education, books for every step of your teaching journey.
Teachers, mark your calendars for BetUK 2025, the world's biggest EdTech event. Join over 30,000 educators at the Excel London from the 22nd to the 24th of January. Discover the latest EdTech innovations, network with peers and access hundreds of hours of CPD. Did we mention it's 100% free for educators? Whether you're looking for inspiration or practical tools to enhance your teaching, BET has it all. Don't miss this opportunity to shape the future of education. Register today at uk.betshow.com. That's uk.betshow.com.
And so we have reached the end of another Sunday Late Show on Teachers Talk Radio, the home of education conversation. I hope you found this evening's show inspiring and informative, and that you might, if you haven't already done so, find the time to subscribe to our Teachers Talk Radio social media accounts, leave a review of our shows on your preferred podcast provider, or consider getting in touch with a request to appear as one of our guests. If you are a classroom-based teacher or have some other close connection to the teaching profession, then we would absolutely love to hear from you. So check out our website at www.ttradio.org and give us the opportunity to put your voice on the air. Thanks again to Kate Fox for tonight's show, and thanks to everyone who has tuned in tonight. Do check out our other Teachers Talk Radio shows this week. We have a number of new hosts continuing to make their debuts, so look up the schedule on the website and give them a listen if you can. This week and every week on Teachers Talk Radio, there is simply so much excellent content to engage with from real teachers working with real students in real schools. You can find anything you've missed of the 2,500 shows so far at www.ttradio.org. And if you have something you want to say or ask others about education anywhere on planet Earth, then perhaps you should also consider applying to join the station as a show host. We are always on the lookout for those with current or recent experience of the classroom and other less familiar educational settings. Full details of that too can be found on our website, www.ttradio.org. That's all from me for this evening. So thank you for listening, and we will speak again in October. Goodbye.
You've You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.